Customs. We are the guardians of our nation's borders. We are America's front line. We safeguard the American homeland at and beyond our borders. We protect the American people against terrorists and instruments of terror. We steadfastly enforce the laws while fostering economic security through lawful trade and travel. And then we serve the people with vigilance, integrity, and professionalism. So if you look at this and you think of everybody who's on this program, you know, we're all here as traders. We're looking at ways to facilitate trade. We're looking at ways to help move products, certainly in today's environment where we have the added challenges that have been presented by the pandemic, even more of a question and issue that we're all grappling with. And, you know, but we have to bear in mind that while Customs is a critical partner to this, they're also a principal enforcement agency. And so a lot of what we will kind of talk about, that's sort of an undercurrent. I think that's important. And that's not to scare anyone. I'm not trying to make you run for the doors, you know, arms flailing. It's just really more to recognize, you know, Customs, their name, Customs and Border Protection, which is interesting. Before 911, it used to be the Customs Service. So we kind of laughingly say, well, they took the word service out of their title. But there's still certainly a trade facilitation element. And I think as we'll see when we go through this framework, that there's certainly a significant interest in facilitating trade with the adjunct of we need to maintain enforcement, we need to be vigilant, as Customs notes in its own, their ethos here. So just a foundation to build from. In terms of the plan itself, what is the plan? What is Customs proposing to do? What were they proposing to do? Well, they really had sort of 4 goals and objectives that they set out. One is to combat, to counter, to deal with terrorism, transnational crime, and to make sure that they are enforcing, again, the laws and making sure that they're reducing the risks that's supposed. To recognize, you know, Customs, while we all think of them as an import agency, they also play a critical role on export. So certainly, you know, they're the inspectors, we're at the ports. Now we file our documentation through ACE, you know, basically a customs interface for export. So, you know, export is sort of, I think, in some ways, a growing aspect of where we might see more enforcement, not just at that point of departure, but also through the filing of documentation information. So that some of the targeting tools and things we're going to talk about along the way here aren't just an import component. There also could be a very strong and growing export component as well. Advanced comprehensive border security and management, right? I think a lot of what we will talk about today is going to be that, and then also probably the third aspect, which is enhancing economic competitiveness by naming lawful trade and travel. And then finally, the fourth sort of goal and objective was to promote integration, innovation, and agility. So the responsiveness, the timeliness, the efficiency of what Customs does, that's also, I think, a very critical element, as we'll see as Customs looks at how trade is evolving and how the tools that are being used are evolving, how also must Customs evolve to address those events. So how do we accomplish it? Well, there's sort of 3 themes that are sort of at the foundation of where Customs is heading. Collaboration, a critical role, a positive role that shows that we need to work with the trade, work with industry, work with associations, work with our other partner agencies, work with other governments in terms of delivering border security and expanding critical partnerships. So it's still, if you notice, an orientation toward border security, but collaboration can wear many hats and accomplish many goals. Innovation, how do we advance and transform Customs? We'll see in a second, Customs is the ultimate legacy agency to our country's founding. And so many of the things that are out there today are still on the books from when Customs was created and our country was created. And then integration, how do we create a better network, whether that's networking with the private sector, networking with other agencies, networking with customs administrations globally or other agencies globally. Again, create better integration, more of a seamless approach to help facilitate trade and facilitate data targeting, and also then obviously where they need to expend their efforts for an enforcement perspective as well. so that was sort of the building block, right? That was sort of where we started back in 2015, and then there was a lot of internal deliberation and discussion going on with the customs. Where do we go next? What is the next step? And then last spring, customs announced, basically I think last a year ago, March, a meeting to be held on what they had entitled the 21st Century Customs Framework, and what they themselves also call this 21 CCF. So you can decide which is easier to say, roll off your tongue. And what the framework was sort of that next step as we take down this broad idea of our vision. Where and how do we maybe effectively implement that? And so what we had developing out of it is the need for a more modernized legal framework, as we mentioned. And Customs is pretty open about it, saying, we don't want to just band-aid what we've done today. We need to really look at sort of who do we want to be when we grow up? I mean, what do we need to wholesale change how we approach things? And my favorite phrase was, and I think it was Brenda Smith who said it, I saw it in a quote, that everything from 1789 to the Mod Act to today is under review. And if we have to tear the house down, we'll tear the house down. And 1789 is when the first laws were enacted in the United States, and customs was part of those first laws. I always like to talk about in training or in seminars the fact that our country in many ways was founded based on tariffs, because the Boston Tea Party, when there was such outrage, was really all about import duties and import taxes. And so one of the early drivers to independence was a protest over tariffs. Tariffs until 1914 were the source of revenue for the United States government, and then the income tax came into effect and quickly moved to overtake tariffs. But for the longest time, that was the principal source of revenue for the government to run the government. So this has been around forever, and many of these laws have been around forever. They may have been tweaked from time to time, and principally the Mod Act would have been the time when we saw some updating. I mean, it's kind of amazing to think, but until the Mod Act came around, the Customs Modernization Act, which was NAFTA was tied to that. It was all part of the same legislation back in 1993. Everything still had to be done by paper. And one of the things the Mod Act did very simply, among more complicated things, was to say, hey, we could deal with things electronically now. You think about 1993 when they said that the means of communication electronically back then were more faxes. We really didn't have sophisticated email systems, if at all. There was certainly no cloud. There were no other ways to communicate and share information. So that was just to let people send something by fax, or other electronic transmission means that might have been available then. I mean, you think of that, what we take of that to now, fortunately, they didn't just say facsimile, they said electronic, so they didn't have to revise the laws again as we move through other means of communicating. But this is sort of the philosophy that Customs is developing, saying we need to decide, can we modify what we're doing, or do we need to almost start over again? And so what we embarked upon with this initiative, with this early March meeting, was the opening of the door to stronger communication between the trade and customs and other agencies as well, as to where we need to go to make sure we're prepared, not just for today, but for tomorrow. And so what the framework is about, or what the 21 CCF is all about, is there are 4 basic pillars that customs identified as sort of the paths that need to be looked at. Now, these are not all moving at the same pace. It's like the horse racing game at the carnival, where everyone has their own squirt gun and the horses all ready to move along at a different pace. That's what we're going to see here. I mean, these are not things that are easily integratable one to the next. Some may require more effort than others in terms of what the end game is. I think that also is still being defined, but we're going to spend a little time on each of these. And what Customs did relative to this framework was they actually had this meeting at the beginning of March, and they had a period of accepting comments on these 5 pillars, and Customs sort of roadmapped out some basic comments and questions, and we're going to go through those one by one. And they asked the trade for input back. And then at the beginning of March, in the Commerce Department building in Washington, they convened a meeting, public meeting, and it was sort of an interesting layout. They had the government sitting up on the dais, up on the stage, with several tables facing the audience. And then there's a pretty good gap, like 15 feet of ground space before the auditorium aspect starts to begin. And on that flat area, they put several tables and they had designated certain people from the trade, and that could be importers, that could be shipping lines, brokers, it could be sureties, anyone engaged in trade, and it was all aspects. And they had these groups sit facing the government, and it was a sort of a one-to-one discussion back and forth, and we all in the audience, and I was there, were sort of watching this fishbowl. And so they had a discourse about, relative to these questions and comments that we're going to go to, about from their perspective, and it may have been from their company's perspective. Many times it was an industry representative. They ended up engaging in this dialogue. So we're going to go through each of these sort of pillars: the enhancing facilitation and security, defining customs and trade responsibilities, ensuring seamless data sharing and access, employing intelligent enforcement, and then protecting and enhancing customs infrastructure through funding. Money's always out there somehow as an issue to be considering. So let's jump into these one by one. So the first one of these was about enhancing facilitation and security. So this is sort of how it laid out in the Federal Register notice that was used, and that was used as sort of the introduction for purposes of the dialogue. So what we have is I'm sorry, I'm trying to minimize these pictures. There we go. I was missing part of my screen. So the concern that Customs expressed was, we need to refine import processes to reflect where trade is heading, to improve the experience of all the parties involved in trade, and then other actors that may or may not today be in the supply chain. And how do we improve our efficiency? The focus was on processes today that are overly burdensome or outdated. So what do we need to modify that exists today or replace today? And we've had obviously we've had a big lull, a big drop off given the pandemic. And so this seems in some ways sort of, out of time just because of where we find ourselves today. And we're going to have to grow back up into the trade cycle. But, prior to these events, trade was continuing to burgeon and just grow dramatically. We'll talk about it really more on a later slide, but e-commerce, in which of course even now has taken off by enormous leaps and bounds this year as well, was creating a greater proportion of the needs of the government, and the use of electronic communication methods by the trade in ways that Customs wasn't using, and technologies in ways that Customs wasn't using, was creating a bigger gap in terms of the ability of those two parties to communicate effectively. And so the questions that were raised here about facilitation and security, and we've actually have two slides on this, is the first questions that were asked of the trade was, so what procedures or requirements can we improve or refine, and how do we do it? And then what are some best practices that CBP should look to maybe adopt? And so the comments back, both through this open meeting that was held and through written comments that were submitted, were such ideas as, well, we need to further adopt what's called the single window. For those of you who don't know, it's been sort of a holy grail for ever since ACE, original automated commercial environment development, to move toward a single window where there's just one interchange point for importers to upload their data regardless of the government agency involved, right? So whether it's Customs, whether it's FDA, whether it's FCC, whether it's NHTSA, whatever agency might be pertinent to your import beyond Customs, is to create one place to send a data flow, and that single flow will satisfy all masters. So certainly for facilitation, very important, and even for security, because there could be other agency concerns and considerations, adulterated product, things that are not properly licensed or supported, improper labeling, safety issues. All of those things can be addressed through this mechanism. Helping something very simply at the point of entry or the point of inspection, making sure that Customs, from an inspection perspective, has the right tools. Can they have handheld devices, and that has been adopted in many instances, so that they can immediately decide what should or should not be targeted, so that containers and containerized freight and other freight that's coming across the border doesn't need to be stopped or even held up at all, because they've already have the tools in their hand to know whether or not this is something or someone they maybe need to look at more carefully, and they can release other trade, legitimate trade, known trade immediately for further onward distribution. Verifiable credentials. This has become a big issue because we've seen in the anti-dumping world where parties would import and, they were a non-resident importer, and they disappeared, and the ability to collect duties disappeared with them. And so we've seen customs take some initiatives sort of through an expanded what we call the 5106, which is a sort of importer identification card, having additional fields, additional requirements. There's initiatives working with customs brokers to make sure that they do some verification. As you know, last week they issued proposed revised customs regulations for brokers that would look at the broker playing a more critical role at validating and verifying importers, and also identifying where risk exists and being obligated to notify customs and resign an account if they feel that their customer is not following the law. That's a very critical potential development that we all should pay very close attention to. Decentralizing identification, maybe not having one common importer ID for all locations of receipt relative to an importer, and looking at creating more location-specific identifications, which might also tie to flows and concerns in that regard as to whether there's a lane that we need to be more worried about. And then just simple things like interoperability, international best practice. You know, can we show across agencies, across governments, a way for data to be shared? There's been initiatives, we'll talk about it later, like globally networked customs, where maybe the export data from one country becomes the import data for the next country, which would facilitate legitimate trade, avoid bad actors who are trying to use dual invoicing and other schemes to, you know, reduce the value they declare into another country relative to the value they declare at export, and also ensure delivery or receipt to end users identified in export declarations relative to an import to another country. The second piece to facilitation and security was another concern that customs identified was we have new technology emerging, and how should CBP be embracing this technology? What can they embrace operationally? So to improve trade facilitation and also trade enforcement. And so these were the questions that were asked. What are the technologies that customs really needs to consider or to adopt? What's the private sector doing today? And what are they doing that's not compatible with how customs is working today? And then what is a new technology that is likely to be embraced that could be disruptive to how we do business today, right? Disruptive can be, you know, that it disruptive in terms of what it enables someone to act more efficiently, and maybe customs isn't catching up, or what flip side of that is it's challenging for pretty much the same reason within the trade ecosystem. And here's where we really started the discussion transition to blockchain. And we're going to hear blockchain mentioned probably a lot through the rest of this presentation. You know, I am not a techie, but, you know, blockchain is pretty much an unbreakable chain of data. It's not sort of linear, it's sort of stepped in nature. So different pieces of data are collected in different links of a chain. And so if you disrupt one link in the chain, you can't disrupt other links in the chain. So it creates more security and integrity to data and more reliability. So once the blockchain is constructed, it can't be broken. Well, can't is always a word, but it is a chain, it's strong, and these pieces move independent but interoperable to one another. And so it gives both customs and the trade greater confidence that the data that's being submitted is reliable up front, right? It's basically been vetted because it's through blockchain process that the data has been collected and provided. So a critical element that that I think pretty much everyone that I remember speaking at the session mentioned blockchain in one capacity or another. Artificial intelligence and machine learning, other aspects, you know, whether or not we need to look at, are there other means to transmit data, to review data, to accept data that don't require human interaction, right? So that we can have artificial intelligence. It also ties to robotics and machine learning as sort of a paired idea, that would be tools that the trade's embracing and that customs needs to look at as well. So to facilitate the movement and the review of data more readily. The cloud, obviously everyone's in the cloud. Can the government use the cloud, be in the cloud? How efficiently and effectively can they? If it's viable, if the government's comfortable with all the protections of data that might be afforded, then it becomes a powerful tool, because just like all businesses are using the cloud today, you know, you can share this information across your entire platform, and it's the same data that's being looked at, whether it's being looked at in Yuma, Arizona, or Champlain, New York, or any point in between. So the cloud is another critical tool that obviously Customs is well aware of, and how to embrace it, use it is another question. Um, Authentication, verification, we already talked about identified credentials, but this also manifests itself here because companies are using those for their own purposes, for their supply chain. It ties in many ways into CTPAT. It ties into some of the new cybersecurity initiatives and information security that we're seeing under the new minimum security requirements that are coming out of CTPAT. So this really fits in very well with the framework to CTPAT, and I, there is an overlap. There is certainly an overlap here where we talk about security. And then things like how data should be transmitted, uploading data, image processing. What is the platform for the DIS for the image data is being provided? Customs have gone through a process of what would be their platform to work from. But it's not the same all around the world, and that's another critical challenge. And things like the trade facilitation agreement coming out of the WTO. That's one of the things that they've talked about, is making sure we're speaking from a common language in terms of data imaging and data processing, the tools that are used to accept, review, and respond from a data image perspective. Okay, so that's the first pillar, which is facilitation and security. The second pillar is how do we define customs and trade responsibility? So here, what Customs threw out as what they identified as the concern, and the questions that they threw out to the public to sort of ruminate on and provide responses and thoughts back on, is that, again, technology is going to be rampant throughout what we talk about here. Technological advances, new modes of conducting business. We have new actors and new supply chains, right? So legal frameworks that were developed, really, again, going back to 1789, a lot of this, there was no airplanes, there was no rail, there were no roads, right? So everything moved by ship, right, at that point in time. And so obviously we've made modifications for manifesting and other means and other inspections and other considerations, but a lot of what's developed is still containerized. CTPAT initiative, all containerized from the get-go, right? That was the main flow that was contemplated from day one. But now we see e-commerce. Here's where e-commerce becomes super critical. We now have more direct-to-consumer shipments, further expansion of use of couriers. We have low-value shipments that might evade or avoid, depending on which word you want to use and who your audience is, the laws, right? Or they might be just accepted from the laws because they're low value, and the government has decided in its wisdom that was appropriate. And a lot of this growth has come as a natural result of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, TIFTIA, which increased the low value shipment from $200 to $800. And that alone has caused just a remarkable increase in volumes of e-commerce. And so, this is not something Customs was ready for. And obviously today with the pandemic, I mean, it's taken off even a higher multiplier effect that was already in place. So we are still seeing a dramatic growth in trade, but it's trade through different avenues, not through the flows that were there historically, not through the flows that the laws were designed to address. And so this is a critical challenge for Customs, is what is their role? And then also for the trade, what is the trade's responsibility if we're going to continue to see this ramp up in e-commerce? What else, who other partners are there in the supply chain today that may not have existed historically? Are there new ones? Are there parties that are sort of being sidelined that were critical before, and that maybe they're not the intermediary that used to be the course? And then obviously this translates to issues of safety, legal compliance. If we don't have visibility to these transactions and these flows, how do we ensure that we have good actors out there in terms of promoting legitimate trade and growth? So sort of the questions, as we've sort of already kind of referenced, are what are the new roles that Customs hasn't considered in the legal framework? How do we embrace them? What changes in laws need to be considered? What changes in oversight need to be considered? For e-commerce platforms, how do we interface and deal with potential concerns about illicit trade, low value, counterfeit, or infringing shipments, goods that maybe aren't complying with FDA requirements, or FCC or CPSC or whatever agency might be concerned about the consumer, or any other agency that has that sort of oversight or concern. And how can the new actors work with CBP and improve trade security? it's actually referenced later, but one partner that has been discussed is foreign trade zones, because there's a natural flow of merchandise coming into a foreign trade zone. There's an oversight that's inherent in the admission of merchandise into a zone. And then as goods come out of the zone, there's an organization, a process, a reporting, and a decrementing that occurs that would naturally create a potential throughput that would be supportive. So foreign trade zones is an area that Customs has looked at very, very critically as sort of a new actor in the sense of a potential partner to work with on things like low value or e-commerce shipment. And there actually is and some initiatives out there through the foreign trade industry right now and the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones to work with Congress to develop some legislative changes or fix that would help facilitate the use of zones, particularly in the environment of e-commerce, while also giving Customs that oversight and visibility that they need. So what other things can happen here that might be helpful? Well, because we may see traditional brick and mortar companies move toward e-commerce, is maybe Customs need to look at how they expand account-based processing. Account-based processing has been around as a concept since the MOD Act, and that was all under the principle that we manage an importer as an account. So no matter who, where they import, what they're importing, they're one importer of record. Maybe they're even a umbrella organization with multiple subs underneath them, and we develop an account mechanism. There was the idea of national account managers, which came out of the MOD Act, which really only dealt with high level, significant volume importers. And then there was a principal idea of what we call port account management, which was meant to deal with smaller, maybe one port accounts. And those processes work to some degree, but they've sort of been sidelined. They're not as efficient and effective today as I think they once were. Certainly there's still national account managers who are there to facilitate the sharing of information and also to help as needed, but it's not as critical of a role as it once was. And maybe there's a need to sort of re-energize that as we think more about account-based processing. The use of the centers of excellence and expertise as Customs is reorganized and move toward this sort of industry-based approach to analysis, that's another area where there's potential for growth and account-based processing. And then moving toward periodic processing. We already have periodic payment. Do we move toward periodic entries? There's been a discussion about maybe moving away from the one-by-one entry process, moving to a weekly or a monthly or some kind of a compilation process that would be more supportive. Now that would work against things like using informal entries, and so maybe that's not an answer for everything, but those are other things that they've talked about. And then the most provocative idea was, do we move from a model of the importer of record being the risk party to exporters or producers? Do we make them more accountable? Now, how legally you assert jurisdiction over them is a different question, but there's been some discussions that the importer of record may not be the right party in all instances, if in any instance, to be sort of that risk party, because they're the last part of the flow, and they may not have access to the information, and they may not know what's occurring at an earlier stage. While they're certainly making declarations or representations, they may not be the right audience to get to for purposes of addressing concerns or getting further data to support compliance, whatever it may be. So these are some of the ideas that have been thrown out there for thought. Now, all of these are ideas right now, right? So these are just ways to think or formulate. Nothing's been adopted or adapted in any particular way, but it just shows how far afield we're taking some of these discussions for consideration. Another critical pillar is how do we ensure seamless data sharing and access? And here, what the concern was is, again, the growth in data. I mean, big data is such a sexy term these days. People use it all the time. Again, how data can be transmitted and the volumes, increasing volume of data, increasing size of data. Do we have the pipe? Do we have the bandwidth to support it from the trade to Customs? I mean, if you look at one comment was even like, ACE, for example, has a limitation on the number of lines that can be transmitted, for example, through a reconciliation process. Well, that needs to be eliminated, right? We need to recognize that we could have huge volumes of data. You file a protest through ACE, and there's a limitation on how much you can upload at any one time, if at all. We had one client where their data was so huge that ACE couldn't even accept it. And we had challenges with the import specialist viewing a protest saying, well, I need you to send me that data electronically. And we were very clear that because of the way the data was imaged, it was scanned, drawings and things. It was enormous data, and we're going to send one thing at a time, and it was not viable. So we had to send hard copy, which sort of threw them for a loop. What to do with it? They had to give us an address where to send it to. So thinking about that, about how we share data, how we get data, how we access it is critical. Certainly, questions were asked about what would importers like to see, what would customs like to see, what improvements can happen. So ACE was a critical discussion point here about the need to improve the querying capability. We shouldn't have to have only several core reports and then know how to add attributes. There should be more cross-functionality. There's data elements that people frankly don't care about. I mean, why do we need to get that as part of our download? So the need to look at changing reporting structure and what's provided was a discussion point. There are still a lot of pieces to ACE that have not been completed, and that there needs to be some incentive to get those other pieces done. For example, multimodal tracking, right, and visibility to see how product moves from, truck to ship to rail, then maybe to truck again, right, and how that's being dealt with, and maybe we'll sprinkle in some flights as well along the way. Do we need to look at how data is actually provided? There was the question about whether we should look at the entry model. So do we need to break down to a part level? Should we provide for data to be reported at a part number level instead of at a classification entry line level? Obviously, that would be an enormous explosion on the data provided. But for anyone who's ever gone through an audit, either internally or externally, or tried to put together a disclosure, one of the biggest challenges is if you only have entry data, you don't know what the parts are. Now, your broker or you internally may have developed an adjunct to that, so you have a way that you've dumped that extra data. But if you're starting from the 7501, you don't know what the parts are at that point in time. And so there's a lot of legwork involved to get there. And it's also true for customs. So some of the discussion has been, do we want to change that dynamic? Because if customs targeted an entry line for a question, and that explodes to 100 parts that are all classified in the same tariff provision, is that really what customs wants or what the trade wants? So something that's been discussed as well. Better data syncing across customs administration. We've already talked about that in other contexts, but it manifests itself here as well. And then sureties are obviously very concerned about having access to data earlier. They've been left holding the bag, particularly on things like non-resident importers and anti-dumping, where they have obligations on the bond to pay up. Or even more simply, that they don't have visibility earlier in the dialogue to make sure they're protecting their risk, working with the principal in terms of responding to investigatory initiatives or requests for information or other things that could create risk to the surety at such a late point of the game that they can't do anything about it. And then also how we process data, maybe electronically. AI comes into play, machine learning comes into play, use of robotics, again, comes into play. All sort of tools that should be considered for improvement for data sharing and access. Our fourth pillar, intelligent enforcement. And some people might say that's an oxymoron, but here we understand what customs is talking about. They only have so many resources available out there to review and to impact trade. And so doing a better job of targeting to really maybe earlier or through better risk weighting or assessment, identify where's the high risk activity. No different than the trade's doing with its risk assessment from like minimum security criteria perspective, CTPAT perspective, right? Doing risk weighting, having access to tools. Obviously the government has access to much stronger, greater intelligence than we do as part of the trading community, but there's still opportunities to make sure that they're not sweeping up legitimate trade and traders in their net that is thereby adversely impacting the flow of trade, and finding better ways to drill down to where the risk really lies, right? This is all about protecting, enforcing the laws and protecting security. So what data can we use? What technology can we use? What predictive tools can we use? So here, blockchain is, again, very critical to this discussion. This is one place where foreign trade zones has come out as well. Again, and a lot of it's because of e-commerce, but because of the nature of data in, data out to a foreign trade zone, the reporting, the compilation of data, the availability through the admission process and withdrawal and entry process, that there are some maybe tools that could be sort of bolt-ons that customs can work with or from, that the foreign trade zones could be a significant and important partner here. Other considerations, again, the centers of excellence and expertise as an industry-based tool, as they sort of are that funnel for the trade relative to the industries that they have oversight to. Maybe doing a better job of sharing with the trade some of the critical targeting points. Obviously not giving away some of their intelligence that's internal if they have active investigations or things like that, but maybe letting the trade be a better partner so that the trade can also help and apply some of these same tools and themselves interface and interact to reduce their own risk, which of course obviously reduces the risk to customs and to the US as a whole. So using blockchain to create better data integrity, using artificial intelligence, using machine learning, working with big data, to do analyses, using the predictive tools that might come out of it. How can that all be done as part of this process? And then one thing they've talked about is maybe pushing out some of the entry points earlier. So more pre-export, not ISF, which is out there today, but even more of an entry, effectively, an early stage entry, which doesn't maybe have all the data elements of the 7501, but has more than what an ISF would have, not just like a 10+2 sort of a notion, but more of the critical data elements and to a more finite degree of classification value, things like that, as a preference claim going to be coming, things like that, that would let, at an earlier point, a review to begin. So if the trade is legitimate or deemed legitimate based on the review, the cargo can be tagged earlier for release. Right, it's sort of like what we talked about CTPAT in Tier 3 and what was the green lane. That there'd be a mechanism even for trade as a whole where we can look at data earlier, make analyses and determinations earlier, and really know ahead of time what we're going to look at. So maybe even while the container's on the water, we could already tell, hey, when it arrives to the port, this is going to be looked at. We can tell the trade, your container is subject to exam, and here's why. Maybe there's a chance for the trade to respond and say, well, here's what was you're wrong with your analysis of thought process. So all of this is, again, using more of an intelligent enforcement mechanism and separating good actors from bad. And then protecting and enhancing the infrastructure. A big part here is really funding. Customs made no bones about it. There are a lot of things we're trying to do. ACE was supposed to be sort of a 4-year exercise. It became like a 16-year exercise because there was constant battle over funding, and finally there was a commitment made by Congress to provide funding that was needed. But even there, like we said, all the core functionality of ACE has been implemented, but there are other tools and mechanisms that are supposed to be part of ACE that don't have money today. Other agencies as well certainly have the same need. And as they are trying to embrace technology, if they don't have the funds to develop the new tools, or they don't have the funds to invest in blockchain or AI or whatever it is that they're looking to, well, then we're going to continue with these roles that we have today. And so they're not asking companies to directly contribute, but they're certainly asking companies to help them. What can we do? Help us by lobbying Congress for funding, the funding that we need that's critical to moving forward to helping the trade. Are there other ways that we can look for funding that might be out there? And certainly the trade's not asking customs to find other means to create fees or things like that. But that was certainly a question that was asked. Is there a better way to change the funding process to fees that are collected are applied for certain purposes, right? So that it goes like to ACE, for example, or as they collect merchandise processing fees, can they be channeled? Harbor maintenance fees have a dedicated purpose, right? They're dedicated for the maintenance of the harbors, the dredging, all those things that go with that. So that fund is directly allocated for that purpose. But MPF is sort of a little more generic in nature. So can we create sub-channels out of that for people to direct funding for particular purposes? And maybe that's a means to increase the customs funding available to the government. So those are the 5 pillars. I know we went through it kind of quickly, but in the interest of time, this is as far as we can go. I will say, and I think the next slide shows that there's some information on Customs website. It's not a lot. There's not a lot of detail that we talk about here because this is still an initiative. I think from the March meeting, the transcript from a year ago. So if you're really geeked out or you really just have time on your hands or want to take a nap, it's like 360 pages of a transcript. You can certainly read through that and see who was representing the trade and industry and other 3PLs and the like, relative, and who was there from the government. And read through that. There was some interesting stuff in there and some interesting exchange. One of my favorite exchanges was, I think it was one of the ones from an ocean shipping line, and they were talking about helping with enforcement, intelligent enforcement, and things like cybersecurity. What tools are you using to vet potential customers and flows. And he point blank made it clear to the government. He said, I'm not going to tell you everything we're doing, because if I tell you everything we're doing, I'm undermining my own cybersecurity, my own protections. So you may want us to be a partner, but there's only so far we can go with that partnership, because we're not going to bare our soul in terms of the things that we're using, because then that's undermining my own security protocols. So critical thought, and it's a very valid point, and Customs agreed that we have to find that balance between where, maybe it's more adopting the principles, the concepts, the tools, what softwares worked, what technologies worked, and obviously not delving into exactly how people are applying those tools to help their own causes. So from here, well, where do we take it? We have this exchange. They actually did, after the meeting, a second round of eliciting comments from the trade. They've absorbed all that information that was submitted back from the trade. It probably wasn't as much as I think they expected. I think they thought they might get more information. There was certainly industry associations that filed, and a lot of it was particular to their own concerns, which makes perfect sense. But they're looking at how do we go deeper from here. So what should be under each of these pillars, the things we do next. A critical partner in this has been COAC, which is the commercial committee of 20 members that's been appointed to represent the trade, and they do interface, and there's subcommittees that have been established on different areas, including the area of working on this development. And they are supposed to be the voice of the trade. So they post they have public meetings quarterly. They post information about the meetings. The results of the public sessions are shared, where they are with their initiatives. So that's sort of the interface, although that doesn't preclude anyone from commenting on it. Matter of fact, Customs has said in their notices that this is open. So there wasn't a closed comment period. You can still communicate if you need to and want to. So something to bear in mind, that there's an opportunity to provide your thoughts if you want to, relative to where these initiatives might head. The Customs is working with the Border Interagency Executive Council to harmonize entry processes. This is cross-border, really, Mexico, Canada, mostly Canada. Also looking at initiatives like that can be then rolled out broader. And then the fourth thing, we're going to talk about a little more about this in the next slide, is they developed something called proofs of concept, which are playing a critical role as we test initiatives, test the tools that we're going to use to see whether they might actually work, or they not answers to how we address these 5 pillars, these considerations. So what are proofs of concept? While they're driven through, Customs has a business transformation and innovation division. They have a technical trade office that works very specifically on looking at new technologies and how they might be integrated or used within CBP, right? Both today, tomorrow, and then further out, right? So these are sort of the crystal ball people, right? They're looking at how trade is moving. They're looking how information, how big data is evolving. What new tools are out there being developed by tech companies or other companies that might help with analytics and both current and predictive form. So those are being developed with COAC. And what comes out of these proofs of concept is an assessment of, based on what they've done, does it work? Will it work? Is it helpful? They evaluate internally first the results of this testing from four dimensions: a legal perspective, a policy perspective, a technical, and an operational perspective. And the first one they did was in late 2018. They did a proof of concept for NAFTA and CAFE, and they were testing blockchain in particular and how it might work with the entry summary process. So here's a situation where people are claiming NAFTA or CAFE at the time of entry, and the question was, can we use sort of blockchain as a means of more readily validating and evaluating the claims made on the entry summary, right? And so they found the result of this was extremely positive. They found that using blockchain increased the communication between Customs and the trade, because there was a good throughput, a means of getting data. It was also a means of knowing that you had reliable data, because the data that was provided was blocked. It was locked, right? It wasn't something that could be manipulated or revised or used further. So no matter where it went from, like the producer point who's certified onward, there was data integrity, right? So there was better receipt of data and information. There were fewer gaps in the information received. And because of that, Customs could more quickly if it chose to target an entry for NAFTA-CAFTA compliance, it was more expeditiously able to process those requests and act on them, right? We reduced hard copy needs because now, again, we have data integrity. So there wasn't the question, can I rely on the data? Because blockchain created that comfort. I mean, could there still be instances where they ask for hard copy to validate the blockchain? Yeah, but as they move through this process, there's greater confidence that blockchain is going to provide reliable data, and it reduces the duplication, and then it also let the targeting occur where the targeting needed to, and let legitimate trade move more readily through without delays. Not so much maybe the goods being released because the goods already would have been released, but with delays in terms of confidence by both customs and the trade that the information provided was acceptable. They've also done one proof of concept on IPR rights. Same thing using blockchain, and the results of that assessment was also extremely positive, that they had greater confidence in that there wasn't infringing or counterfeit goods coming in that were infringing on existing rights. And then there are other ones that are in the chain about verifying credentials. We talked about this already, about creating better data integrity over who is a named importer, and their ability to be there to support, defend, or to even be pursued relative to a claim made in entry. And a lot of this, again, emanated from anti-dumping issues with non-resident importers. So as you can imagine, non-resident importers have been sort of as a subset critically looked at and considered as to whether or not they are a reliable importer that we can go back to if there's an issue that arises relative to an assertion or declaration made in entry. And they've also are developing one from oil pipelines, which is from the spigot all the way out through the end of, or I guess spigot back through the pipe, because there's a lot of specific issues about oil flow and how it's reported, how it's tracked. And so this would create sort of a very specific assessment at that level. So you can see these proofs of concept can be broad in nature, right? Protection of IPR rights, assessment of preference program eligibility, or specific credentials to an importer. Oil pipeline as an industry, and even a sub-element within the industry. So there are a lot of different levels this can be manifested, and that's the types of things that the government's doing right now, is testing it. So again, this just shows you there are a lot of moving pieces here, and a lot of different ways this might be applied at different levels. So industries might get together, trade associations might get together. They might want to work and create initiatives working with, through COAC and customs to say, we have an idea, an initiative here. And, if everyone's on board, it might be a way to get sort of greater acceptance relative to that industry or that flow in terms of the confidence level of the data that's being provided, and help facilitate legitimate trade. So when we're going to get there, anyone's guess. I mean, obviously what's happened this year with the pandemic has sort of changed the equation quite a bit. And so, that's not a hard stop. There's certainly initiatives proceeding. Companies are still embracing new technology. I mean, arguably they're embracing them even more as we move to a different sort of a work environment and work structure. So these are not being pushed aside, but there are other priorities that need to be dealt with. At the same time, as we mentioned, further incredible growth in e-commerce in this environment has also resonated and made it clear we can't not implement these tools, because it seems pretty likely that this growth in e-commerce, while it might temper down a little bit as we move forward and come out of the situation we're in today, it's not going to go back 100%, never, right? So we're still going to see this growth, and we're going to see more growth inevitably over time. So these tools need to be looked at and considered. And there is an email address, as I note here, so you can provide comments if you want, or feedback on these ideas. There's also a website address, and that's the website for 21CCF. That's where you'll find sort of things about these 5 pillars, some things about these proofs of concept that have been completed to date. I think the transcript is also available through that website, and some other tools. And, as Customs does with every sort of a sub-site they develop, the intent here is to make these dynamic. So they will be adding information as warranted as things move forward, and continue to grow and expand the sort of the repository, the library that's available for you to see what's happening next. So something to monitor, to manage, to follow. these aren't Federal Register notice like things that are happening, so that's not a tool today. Certainly, if they did propose to revise a regulation, or they may have to revise a statute more specifically, like they did in the Mod Act, um, then those things will become more publicly known at that time. Okay, so that's sort of customs and sort of the interface with them. So what does this mean to you? What does this mean to the trade? I mean, how does this impact what you might be doing today? And if you recall from one of the earlier slides, there were sort of three themes that customs was working from: the innovation and integration and collaboration. I think those were the three. Well, we sort of have three sort of themes for the trade as well. And so we've sort of encapsulated them as digitization, centralization, and globalization. So, for digitization, I mean, that's really been pretty much the undercurrent of what we've talked about so far, right? How we communicate, how we share data, that is continuing to evolve. If not, certainly for industry, it may already have fully evolved. So it's more a question of creating that bridge back to the government, or any government, not just the US government. Centralization, how we communicate, we've alluded to this a little with customs with things like the Cs, the Centers of Excellence, and how that's changing the way a broader account-based processing, things like that. And we're going to go through this with some slides in a moment. And then globalization is the outreach of communication internationally, and some of the developments that are happening internationally, albeit today, again, slowed down because of the pandemic, but still a need and still a desire by governments worldwide. So we'll go through each one of these just a little bit. So digitization first. Digitization critically does not equal automation. I know that there are a lot of promotions out there and advertising and things saying, give us your data, we can do everything for you. Well, I'm sorry to say that's not true. It's just not true. For example, we talk about entry. People will say, if you give me access to your ACE data, I can determine how compliant you are. No, they can't, because your ACE data doesn't go to the part level. It doesn't drill down to that level. Your ACE data only gives you the entry line. So it can't tell you your rate of compliance. That might tell you trends like, are you increasing use of a preference program? Are you changing the classifications you're using? Are you changing your sourcing, or are you seeing more brokers being used? That is visible data. That is visible data. So that's information that can be used and to look for changing trends or worrisome trends as the government focuses on certain countries or certain industries or certain classifications. But to tell you overall that it can do all the targeting you need and the compliance risks you have, it can't. Not today, not the way the entries are structured. Now, if we move to part level declarations, different ballgame, right? Then we're talking something very different. So maybe there's as that evolves, this will evolve. But at the same time, that's not to dismiss automated tools, because they are still critical as we have big data, as we have larger processing, as we move from NAFTA to USMCA, in whatever it is, T-minus 21 days at this point. That's not a manual process. Now, if you're bringing 2 or 3 parts, sure it is. But if you have a myriad of sourcing, and as your purchasing people look to resource, I mean, you look at things like 301 and 232 and how those implicate what you're doing from a sourcing perspective, anti-dumping, what that means to you. So yes, you need automated tools to help you evaluate and automate where they can, to help you organize your data and maybe evaluate your data, certainly in different contexts. But it's not the overall means to ensuring compliance, and it would not be adequate to communicate to customs if they came back with questions, right? You could have just given the entry line. That wouldn't do it. And also the risk is, if we rely only on automated tools, if our data is flawed, then garbage in, garbage out. We always talk with clients about like NAFTA or USMCA eligibility, and it's based on rules of origin and classification. And we tell them clearly, if you don't know how to classify your good, you don't know how to classify your materials, you might get an answer, but you're not going to get the right answer because you're not using the right data. So critical concerns, changes in laws and regulations, right? A lot of automated tools are based on a static model. So if they don't update or have a dynamic component to change as the laws change quickly, then we're going to have issues. Screening on export tools are a great example of where we do have dynamic models, because as the entities that are identified on the different lists for export controls change, screening tools update, either real time or batch processing overnight, whatever. So that is a great example of a tool that is extremely beneficial from an export control perspective. And then obviously, if you have program glitches or breakdowns, we've had certainly that happen a lot of times with clients where for some reason, maybe in a foreign trade zone environment, there's a bills of material aren't captured 100%, or there's a change in sourcing of some component and the new component part level is not picked up. And so it's not captured as part of the zone process. That's an example where that can happen. So while automated tools are essential, you also need to make sure that there's that bridge, that there's the right communication, that those tools are working with the right data in a real-time basis and can share information both for you from internal audit perspective and risk weighting and assessment, but also to any government agency you're sharing with. It also requires investment, right? I mean, and today certainly we have a challenge with funds available for investment. So it's essential as we move to more big data, blockchain, AI, robotics, machine learning, whatever tools we might be using, that we have the right tools to do it. I like to say that, IT is now your biggest partner in trade, because as big data is coming in and as big data is going out, you need those tools. I mean, CTPAT alone, with the expansion in the cybersecurity environment and information security requirements, the notions of things like money laundering and how you have to interface with your AP and from a receipts perspective, this is avenues of data that you may not historically see or communicate through. So IT being a critical partner makes sure you have robust enough machines that can process this data, that can receive the data. It's critical. And obviously, investment in staff, that they're knowledgeable about what's going on. Like, undertaking training like this is an investment. Thanks to our partners here, it's a free investment today, but not everything happens that way. But certainly as we look at the tools we're using, the needs of the tools, there has to be adequate funding as sort of a sub-element with like maybe an IT budget for trade compliance. So make sure you're considering that IT investment as you go back, maybe as you prepare for budgeting year on year, that there is a breakout for that IT investment relative to trade compliance. And then we also have to have knowledge. So, trade compliance needs to understand how these tools work, how to use the data, how to analyze the data. Are you adept at using things like Access? And you have a resource who can do that, who can parse out data. Do you have, again, a machine that can process, a million lines of data at a time? These sound silly, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen computers freeze up, right? You can't do what you need to do because the tools just are not there to sort and digest everything that's needed to look at. The second point is important, right? Where from, how used, and what's produced. We need to know, right? And this is where things like blockchain can become critical, because if we have confidence in the where from, it makes it easier to use that data and then to create results from that data. So again, blockchain, I think, is really, it's here. It's not going away. The government's fully embracing the idea. So if that's not something that's been embraced within your organization, you should talk to your IT resources about it. And then also make sure we can adapt and make changes and keep access to legacy resources. I'm going to pick it up because I know we're going to run out of time and make sure we have time for questioning. So legacy resources are critical. I'm sure many of you will agree. Instances where they move to a new platform, a new ERP, and there's not a tool available to keep the old data because they haven't thought about what was needed from a trade perspective. Second sort of theme, centralization. Again, we'll go through this quickly. The transition to centers of excellence and expertise has changed the relationship. So while historically you may have been able to deal with a port of entry and you knew the people in the port and that's who you went to all the time, a lot of the people in your port don't even work in the industry you're involved in anymore with time, because now they're in a virtual center. And so you might submit something to your port and it gets sent back out to a center and then it gets resent to someone in another part of the country who doesn't know anything about you. So being an effective communicator, making sure the data you provide up front at the first blush hopefully covers everything you need, will reduce the need for someone who doesn't know you to engage with you. So like we said, the next model, right? Who you know is who knows you. That's critical. That's a critical takeaway in my mind. So they have to understand your business and your business model. Like we say, it's better to be an eagle than an ostrich. Don't bury your head in the sand. Soar above the crowd too, I guess, and make sure that you have information you can share readily in the format needed. but we also have to be cautious, recognizing that while the Cs are there for business facilitation, customs, as we mentioned right at the beginning, is still enforcement first. Matter of fact, the Cs, the discussion and the representation of the Cs over time has actually taken on a much stronger of an enforcement mindset than it did in the early stages. They have really pushed forward the idea that the Cs are about enforcement. They're enforcement by creating an industry-based approach to be able to better identify how companies are acting within an industry and what makes sense and what doesn't. So they're doing baselining across an industry, right? So that's for enforcement, that's for targeting. That's what they're doing this for, right? So recognize that. So yes, be a partner with customs, but also make sure that what you're sharing shows you know how to share information, right? They also look at if someone is asking them a question that seems so elemental that that's going to raise the bar in their mind to say, does this guy really know what he's talking about? You know, do we need to look at this company more carefully? So it's not a bare your soul environment, not the C's. You can't do that. I would never advocate you do that. There's inherent risk in doing so. So please be cautious how you work with the C's. And then the last idea is globalization. You know, we mentioned earlier in this last bullet point is sort of critical. The WTO, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, the one real accomplishment that's come out of the World Trade Organization multilaterally is to help countries, developing countries, move toward a more electronic means of communication, a better facilitative mode of communication. I mean, they're skipping whole methodologies and not through the evolutionary process the United States has done, but moving right to electronic data sharing, information sharing. There's information sharing agreements between the United States and other countries where then our export data is being provided to other countries to baseline against the import data. Now, you may not be on both sides of that equation. That's fine. But if you have an affiliate who's an importer and you're the exporter, they're going to try to marry up that data as much as they can to make sure that there wasn't anything that happened between point A and point B so that there's incorrect representations being made at entry, right? So a critical thing to make sure that flow of the data is good and reliable. And this globally networked customs is another initiative and revenue package from WCO, which is trying to help developing countries as well find means of revenue because again, they're much more dependent on tariffs today. They haven't moved to maybe an income tax model that's effective. So tariffs are still critical for them. So that plus increase in trade agreements, bilaterally, regionally. You know, we've moved away from regional trade agreements. That's not the mindset of the administration. But even the bilateral trade agreements we're trying to work on, most of these are not free trade agreements, they're smaller agreements. So they may not have the comprehensiveness of information sharing, but it's still something to look at and be cautious about as we negotiate deals with other countries around the world. Okay, so what does it all mean? Last slide, and then we can open for questions. Well, there's change happening, and it's happening very quickly, and the government's trying to keep up with it. So probably a little patience is required because funding is an issue, resources is an issue, e-commerce is an issue, and so understanding how that can work and evolve. They do want a partnership with the trade, but invariably the movement will be slower than what the trade is able to do through its own investment and its own tools. But this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to be engaged, to talk about the tools that are being used, to try to get the government to work from the same platform and the same communication tools, right? So we've all seen where different ERPs have different capability of communicating with the government, you know, and whether you have to adapt information to fit the government model. Well, here's a chance to shape what the government does and how they use data. So it's a critical opportunity. Certainly software providers are engaged in this discussion as well. And brokers and forwarders and other parties who are direct conduits to the government are doing this also. And then obviously educating your leadership and letting them know how critical this is. Again, part of this becomes the funding question, but also as you move to use big data, understanding again that to the extent you have cross-border movements and how essential trade is to what you do, that you need those tools to help you facilitate legitimate trade and hopefully reduce the friction with customs and help goods get to market or to your customer base, whatever it might be, more efficiently and more effectively. So that's it. I'm done. If there's questions, I know Al was going to manage those if there are any out there. Thank you, everyone.
Jeremy, I'm going to, I asked Caitlin if she would do that. I sent a question over and and I'd encourage questions from everyone. I've not received any from anybody in the group. So if you're getting ready to prepare a question, send it to Caitlin. Just go down, click on her name, and send it over to her, and she can coordinate that part. Jerry, I had a question with respect to e-commerce and the volume of e-commerce even before the pandemic, and what might happen in terms of after the pandemic. Why you might see some change. I think it's going to grow exponentially. I think you said that as well. Maybe not as high. I don't know. I don't know what it's going to look like. Long story short, Customs has been talking about facilities such as express consignment facilities to do inspections and those kinds of things. Do they think that FTZs might be? I mean, they're set up secure and all those kinds of things. Do you get a sense that those are that's a plausible proposition to put in front of them, and perhaps they're already considering it?
There has been discussions. Certainly, the Office of Field Operations within Customs sort of has oversight to Foreign Trade Zones program. And there are several point people in Customs who've been designated. They participate in the NEFTZ in meetings and events. They participated in separate meetings with the organization as well. Not that that's the only avenue they have, but certainly an association is critical mass there. And there's definitely been a lot of discussion. I mean, Foreign Trade Zones have always been held out as a great partner for CTPAT because of the inherent security protocols and things that are in there. So that alone has always been looked very favorably upon when people want to participate in CTPAT. And certainly from e-commerce, there's been a lot of discussions about how the admission process works, how the inventory tracking process can be supportive. And so, yeah, I think Customs is a partner, and Customs has been very supportive of some of the initiatives that the zone industry has tried to promote, both within e-commerce and outside. And there is, as I mentioned, there is some legislative push going on right now to sort of help foreign trade zones be sort of a conduit for e-commerce by sort of changing the rules of the game. There are some limitations in the statute right now. It's really technical that hamper that, but they're trying to liberalize some of those rules so that actually zones could be used very specifically for the purpose of an e-commerce, outflow.
Yeah. I don't know if Caitlin has any other messages, or any questions. If there's any other questions out there, you can send them to Caitlin. I don't see any. Perhaps Caitlin, are you on?
I have not received any questions. I did want to announce to the group that we were recording this, and we will be sending the recording as well as the PowerPoint to everyone as follow-up. But no, I have not received any questions. So Al, if you want to close it, that would be great.
Yeah, I've got one more question for Jeremy. Jeremy, given the recent trade actions, I mean, the executive branch's activity with respect, well, not just the executive branch, but USTR and Commerce and everyone, their propensity to undertake much more trade actions than any administration that I can recall in recent history. Their propensity to do that has created some underlying issues with respect to how these additional tariffs and these additional how they're going to be applied, and the systems necessary to make sure they're applied and applied correctly. Even in some cases where Customs will readily admit they're not sure of what a duty rate might be on something that's got a tariff been imposed, and it specifically applies to foreign trade zones. How do you think how do you think these kinds of times change Customs thinking about how they're approaching this?
It's been overwhelming for Customs, to be honest. I mean, we talk about e-commerce as an element, but the number of exclusions and the number of actions that are out there. I mean, the increase in the size of the tariff schedule just for all these things going on, like Section 301, right, is just amazing. It's astounding to me, and I agree with you. I mean, these tools are being dusted off from the shelf. And they're being used very liberally. Whether appropriately or not, it's a different question. And at the current time, none of it's going to stop because there's a lot of new things being announced every day, and new use of 232, for example, was announced last couple of days on several different industries, and there's a lot of question whether it's even being done appropriately relative to the law, but that's a different question. And it is overwhelming. I mean, we're seeing like customs needs to, every time there's a new action and there's a new exclusion or whatever might occur, customs has to update its system. And so for example, there was I know because we had a client, it lists 4A, the fourth round of exclusions. USTR announced that on May 8th. It wasn't until May 21st that customs was able to update their system to address that. So for the 13-day period, you still had to pay the 301, and then you had to go back and retroactively claim it, even because the customs just couldn't accept it. And I don't know. It's a great question as to whether is it a perpetually expansionist system? Because there are so many things, and there's so much risk. I mean, everything has a different number now. It's am I in 9903.8801, 02? Am I exclusion under 47 or 49? I mean, you really need a scorecard.
Yeah, you do.
I mean,
That's
you
right.
need a scorecard. You can't do it otherwise.
Yeah. The FTZ community too has delays in being given the volume and changes that are occurring on a day-to-day basis, and exclusions and things of that nature. FTZ folks and FTZ hardware providers are really busier than the dickens.
Right, and that's not even talking about USMCA, which is creating a whole new thing, and we have 21 days until that goes into effect, and we still don't have official regulations.
Right.
We have something posted now you can all look at, but it's not official, and we already know there's a lot of errors in what they posted, and Customs has actually acknowledged there are a lot of errors in what was posted on USTR's website, and they're trying to collect those all to fix them. So I would anyone who's still on the call, if you've seen something that looks problematic, if you've had a chance to look at that, it doesn't seem right relative to the agreement and the text, you need to notify someone, because Customs is collecting all those, and they're going to go back and try to get modifications made before these rules are issued. So and Customs is trying to train itself in parallel as these rules are about to go into effect. So a whole other world of challenges is going to present itself in 3 weeks. And hopefully there'll be an informed compliance period where everyone realizes we're all learning at the same time, and they don't try to force enforcement from day one. And that's what we're all hoping for, but it's not clear how lenient the government's going to be at this point. They haven't been totally clear themselves as to how far they're going to take.
Yeah, that's terrific. I don't have any other questions. I don't think Caitlin has any other questions, anything sent directly to her. So if that's not correct, Caitlin, you'll tell me, I'm sure. And so, Jeremy, thank you so much for your time and preparing this presentation and your expert review of these issues. I certainly appreciate it. I got a lot from it the first time. The additional information you shared today gave me a different perspective on several things, and certainly the times give you a different perspective on several things. And so I know more about what you were talking about before, and have several more questions about what lies ahead. So we'll all experience that together. So thanks so much for joining us. And do you have any closing comments or anything, Jeremy?
No, I would express my thanks again to all of you and everyone who participated. It's always good to be engaged with a group of fellow geeks who enjoy the trade and what's going on even in these challenging times. So everyone go forward, good luck, and thank you again very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for joining in, and I think we'll just leave the conference now. Thanks so much.
Thanks everybody.